Welcome, class. Now we're on to state management part 2. Hopefully you've seen the video that I uploaded earlier about the quick fixes and introduction to anxiety. Now we're going to start talking about some of the theories and the deeper reasons why you might be facing communication apprehension and how to deal with these on a deeper level. And the idea is you can use the quick fixes for the short term and you can use the deeper fixes for the long term, and then you'll be good to go. Now, but before I begin, I have a brief message from our sponsor. Just for background, people who don't know who Marshawn Lynch is a running back for the Seattle Seahawks. Last year, or I believe the year before, there was a huge controversy about him not wanting to talk to the media ever. So basically, he avoided press conferences, or he was very minimal at them, and people are like, how come Marshawn Lynch doesn't talk to the media? Now, I'm not a Seahawks fan, but I love this commercial, and it made me think of this class. Enjoy.
When Pepsi approached me about being their spokesman, I said, I don't know. I don't really like to speak. So they said, well, Pepsi's all about trying something new. Give it a shot. So I said, okay, as long as I don't have to speak. And they said, okay, would you at least move your lips? Glug, 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 glug.
Speech mode, boss.
So the takeaway from that, speech mode. Anytime you're giving a good speech and you do well, it's speech mode. Okay, so there are two main sources by which communication apprehension can arise. The first is trait-based. And when you have trait-based communication apprehension, what you're basically saying is the reason you can't do public speaking, or the thing that makes you nervous, is something that's associated with you as a person. The most common thing that I'll hear is, I'm introverted, okay? So the argument that's trying to be made is, I get nervous because I'm an introverted person and I just don't talk to people and I just don't like to talk in general. Now, this can also be like, I get nervous with public speaking because I don't have a loud voice. I get nervous with public speaking because I'm not pretty enough. Or I get nervous with public speaking because, something with some trait that you have that makes you think that, like, because you have this trait, nobody wants to hear from you and that you just are doomed to be a bad speaker for the rest of your life and there's nothing you can do about it, okay? Now, on the introverted note, the thing is, with introversion, the whole goal of this class and of public speaking is just to get you to talk in front of people. Now, only about 7% of the population actually suffers from a clinical case of introversion where they don't talk to people at all, and those people usually have some kind of clinical or counseling that goes along with it. Most people who are introverted don't have that extreme of a problem. Most people who claim to be introverted are really just shy at first and maybe just have to warm up, but will talk if they have to. And I want you to keep in mind that there are lots of introverted people out there who end up being great speakers, salespeople, and all of that because they know how to think. A great one is Jack Dorsey. He's the founder of Twitter. That dude is a well-known introvert, but he gives great speeches. And the whole idea is you don't have to become extroverted to be good at public speaking. You just have to get up in front of people and know how to talk. That's all you have to do. And so we will deal with those kinds of things. Even in the online class, I think we'll be able to touch on this, at least pretty well. If not entirely all the way, but I think we will touch on this. So the idea of this kind of communication apprehension is I have some trait and therefore I'm bad. But there really is no trait that can hold you back in public speaking unless you let it. Public speaking to me is a skill, and so anybody can learn it and anybody can be good at it. The other source of anxiety is state-based. So rather than saying, I get nervous because I'm introverted, what somebody will say is, I get nervous because of some external circumstance. So they'll say, I get nervous because of the audience, or I get nervous because of the size of the stage. And there's generally three that we want to look at. And I'm just going to write these out. So, the first is what I call situation. What makes you nervous is the situation. And what we're talking about is the context that causes it. So maybe what makes you nervous is the number of people in the room. So maybe you have no problem talking in front of 10 people. Maybe that doesn't bother you at all. But maybe when it's like 50 or 500, that's when you start to feel a little bit of anxiety. So that would be situation-based anxiety, okay? Some people, it's the audience that can be the source of their anxiety. For example, professors, for the most part, I don't think, get really nervous talking in front of their students. So even though there's 30 people in the room, that doesn't really bother them that much because it's just their students, right? And students and professors have a kind of relationship that's different than talking in front of your colleagues at a conference, at a professional conference and presenting a paper, or talking to the dean. There, professors probably get nervous before speaking because speaking to your colleagues has a lot higher standard than speaking to your students, you see? So that's an audience-based source of your anxiety. The third could also be goal-based. So maybe it's not the situation, maybe number of people in the room doesn't bother you or the size of the room. Maybe it's not even the audience. It's not even a matter of who's in the audience or the stakes there. Maybe what it is actually the goal. So if your goal is you have to give a speech, and if this speech doesn't go well, then you don't make the sale and the company loses money, maybe that's what makes you nervous. So it's the stakes, if you will. And in which case, that's going to be the source of your anxiety. So from situation to situation, you may not have anxiety, just depending on what's going on. Maybe if it's a small group of 3 people, maybe some of you in your speeches that you're practicing with your groups, maybe you don't feel anxiety because the audience isn't big enough. Maybe if you're talking in front of 50, maybe then that's when you'll reach your threshold. But some people, even 3 people, is going to be a challenge for them. So we just kind of have to work with everybody, and we will come up with ways so that you can reach a wider audience. Okay, so now we're going to look at the 5 frameworks of anxiety. And these are the 5 that we're going to talk about each in depth. You have the behavioral, the learning theory, the biological, the cognitive, and the evolutionary. Now, as I go through each of these theories, each one is different when it comes to anxiety. And each of these theories or frameworks take a different approach to solving your problem. And what you just need to do here is find the one that works for you. And so as I go through these, you might be like, well, the learning framework doesn't work for me, but the evolutionary one does. Okay, then cool. And it might be all of them have something to say about the anxiety that you face, or maybe none of them too, in which case I want to hear about it. So let's get on with behavioral. So when we're taking a behavioral skills framework to distinct to anxiety, the idea is that we're focusing on your actions, and the focus on your actions will help develop your psychology. Now, under this approach, or under this framework, the reason you're nervous when it comes to public speaking is that you don't have the skills. So the problem in a behavioral framework is a lack of skills, okay? And the solution then, if under the behavioral framework, there's actually a couple here, and I probably won't write them all down, I'll probably just tell you them. But the idea is that the reason that you're nervous is that you just don't know how to speak. In other words, that's the behavioral skills framework. And so the solution would be to teach you how to speak. Now, there's a couple of different ways this could happen. So, of course, number 1 would be practice, right? And the good news is we're doing that. In our classes or in our groups, we're practicing our speaking. And so over time, as you get to do these little small group and eventually larger group public speaking sessions, this is going to help you get over your nervousness over time. Another solution is to collaborate. So another thing to do that can help you improve your skills is to work with other people who are doing the same thing that you're doing. So finding a group or a training partner who can function as a support group and can walk you through this or walk with you through this actually. And so that's also why having a training partner in those groups are important, because you're going to have a support group who's going to help you get better, and you're going to help them get better too. And so that's going to help you. Another thing that's good for you is rehearsals, and we're going to make sure that you do rehearsals. Oh, I think I spelled it. Rehearsals. Okay. So that's pretty much, here, I'll fix that. I'm using a different stylus today, I know. She brought my other one, but, it's all good. Okay, rehearsals. Okay. I can't spell it. Okay, rehearsals, that's the word. And finally, taking extra time to practice your speech, right? So taking those extra 30 seconds and just rehearsing, in other words. So the behavioral skills framework is simply practice makes perfect. That's kind of the bumper sticker summary of it. And as you do that practice and you get perfect, you get more comfortable, and the anxiety becomes manageable. The next approach is called learning theory, and the most famous experiment you've probably have heard in your high school psychology class is the Pavlov experiments with Pavlov's dog. So if you don't remember Pavlov, and that's an A, and if you remember the Pavlov's dogs experiment where, he had the dogs, and before he fed them, he'd always ring a bell, and then over time, he did that for a long period of time where before he fed them, he'd ring the bell, and then one day he rang the bell, and he didn't feed them, and the dogs started salivating because the bell became the stimulus for being fed, and that's classical conditioning, in other words. That's the whole idea of conditioning, is just that over time you developed a habit or an expectation, and when there's a stimulus, that stimulus brings about a conditioned response. When it comes to public speaking then, what you do, your problem is that you've somehow learned to associate public speaking with a negative or bad consequence, okay? So maybe sometime in your past, you had a really bad experience with public speaking. Maybe you peed your pants, or you got laughed off the stage and you got tomatoes and papers, spit wads thrown at you or something, or your pants fell down. I mean, I don't know. Something happened to you when you were at some point, and so now you associate public speaking with this bad experience. So, the problem then is you think public speaking equals bad stuff happens. Okay, so we'll just put that. Public speaking means bad stuff. So here's the solution, okay? If you're in this boat where you've had some experience or something happen where you've associated this, the first thing, and this is something that I've done to help me, not that I've had this problem, but it's just something good to think about when I'm in really nervous situations. I always think of myself about to jump off a diving board and just kind of embracing it, or being on a roller coaster. So have you ever been on one of those roller coasters where it's it's going really, really high up, and you're just man, it's going so high up, I'm so nervous, but it's going to be so awesome when we go down. And then you go down, and you're yeah! And you're raising your hands and all that stuff, and you're just embracing it. Think of public speaking like that. It's like a roller coaster. It's scary and it's exciting at the same time, because as you're going to give this speech, sure, it's scary, something can go wrong, but it's also exciting because if you nail this speech, just think of what could happen. Maybe you'll make that sale. Maybe you'll get a standing ovation. Maybe people will come up to you afterwards and be like, dude, that speech was awesome. Thank you so much. Think of the positive things that can happen, because when you're nervous, you're thinking of all the negative things. When you're excited, you're thinking about all the positive things. So think about that. When you're nervous for a test day, the reason is because you're focusing on the negative. But when you're excited for Christmas, it's because you're thinking about all the positives, right? You're getting the presents. You got to turn public speaking from tax day or a test day to Christmas day. Think about all the positives that are going to happen. Now, that's a little side note. And here are some other things you can do from the learning theory perspective. The first thing is you have to extinguish. So, conditioning is all about associating a stimulus with a response. Extinguishing is getting rid of the association between the stimulus and the response. So extinguishing is the opposite of conditioning. So you have to extinguish your fear by getting rid of the association, replacing it with something else. And what you have to do is, like in your groups, for example, that's why when you speak, you want to make sure you give positive feedback, because you want to extinguish the idea that every time you speak, it's always going to be something bad. And you should clap for each other, too, in your groups whenever you do practice speeches, so people can get used to being applauded for. Because some of you have probably never had like a moment of praise where you've just been praised for something like publicly, and you got a round of applause, and people loved you, and you were woo, all that stuff. So start getting used to that in your groups, okay? Secondly, visualization is another great thing to do. The key is to visualize yourself doing the thing really well. So like go in your room by yourself, close your eyes, burn a candle, whatever. But just try to take 5 minutes or so and just sit down, close your eyes, and just think of yourself excelling at the thing that you want to do. So in this case, if it's public speaking, visualize yourself giving your speech and it's going really well. What would that look like? Maybe everyone's really engaged, people are clapping, people are raising their hands. Visualize yourself giving the speech. And there was in fact a study that I read, and it was basically, it was two basketball teams, and they were both trying to improve their free throws. And in one group, they had them just practice their free throws hardcore, at every practice. The other group just visualized themselves practicing free throws. So they didn't actually ever shoot free throws at the same amount as the other team did, but they just visualized themselves. The group that visualized themselves shooting the free throws actually did better than the group that actually practiced doing it. So it's kind of a weird thing, but I think like when you visualize yourself doing the speech well, it starts to once again extinguish like that fear. And what it also does is it just gets you really specific about what you're doing and how you're doing it. And it's just a wonderful thing to do. So visualization, it's not a cheesy Tony Robbins thing. Like, no, this is for real. Like, visualization can really help you. The other solution is what we call solutions-focused therapy. And it sounds all, medical, professional, but it's because there's therapy in it. But here's the idea. Think about your past performances, all right? And just think about the little things that went well. So even if but in my speech, I forgot the last part. That's okay. Before you forgot that last part, what went well? Like, what were some of those little things that went well, even if the thing as a whole didn't, you see? Because here's the idea. Maybe, you didn't rock the speech like you wanted, but maybe you really nailed your intro and people were really engaged and people were just digging it, in the first half. Great. That means you have mastered intros. And so you should call that a small victory. Like, hey, my intros are awesome. Take that experience, bring it with you to the next one. You know what? In my next speech, I know how to write excellent intros now. Now all I have to work on is just transitioning from my intro to my main points a little bit better, and then I can have an awesome speech. Then you do it again. Okay, this time my intros were great. I had a lot better transition. Now all I need to do is I just need to learn how to conclude better. And see, skill acquisition is like climbing a ladder, you see. So most of life is progression like this. You see, a lot of people think life progresses like a straight line. No, life more or less progresses like this. It's a wiggle. You're up and down, then you're up again, then you're down. But it's kind of like the line of best fit. Overall, you improve. But you're going to have ups and downs as you acquire a new skill. And that's okay. Learning is messy, as they say. And so think of every little victory that you have in every practice. Even if the whole thing as a whole doesn't, do everything you want, this is still the thing that you want to keep in mind. Okay? All right. The next framework is the biological framework. And this framework will look at the psychophysiological aspects of a phenomenon. So when you generally give biological explanations for stuff, you're looking at the anatomy and the brain chemistry and all those brain chemicals. So brain science is becoming this huge mainstream thing now where it's like, your brain on exercise, your brain on sugar, your brain on porn, your brain on, and then it's just like long list of things that your brain are on, okay? And so that's kind of the biological, we're focusing on the psychophysiological approaches to stuff. What's love like in the brain? That kind of stuff. So then you make all these cool documentaries about brain science, and you show the brain scans and get the brain scientists from Harvard, talking on there. And, it's kind of its own genre now. Anyways, so from a biological standpoint, the problem for you is that, and it's usually twofold, and I'm not a brain scientist, so, if you are, then sorry, but here's kind of just the basic idea. So, you're made nervous because of neurotransmitters, okay? And also because of your fear response. So basically what happens is when you get nervous, your body goes into like a freeze, fight, or flight response. And when that happens, your autonomic nervous system takes control. And your autonomic nervous system is basically a subconscious thing. It's in charge of like your heart rate, a lot of the physiological things that you can't control consciously. And so the idea is then your body has to do things to adapt, and that's why those adapters come into play. And so the biological approach would say, so you're having these fear responses, essentially, to public speaking. So you see public speaking as a threat. And so the biological approach, though, to solve it wouldn't necessarily be a social approach, but here are some things you can do physiologically before you give a speech to help combat the neurotransmitter releases that are happening as you speak. So we're going to get a chemical answer to this, and it's not drugs, I promise, or doing drugs at least. Okay, so the solutions are, first, oxytocin. So oxytocin is the bonding chemical, and there's a lot of stimuli for releasing oxytocin in your brain. So oxytocin is something that's naturally in your brain. It's not something that you take or get high on. It's something that's naturally in your brain. And it's generally released when you're in bonding situations. So when you pet your dog, that releases oxytocin, and that's why we become attached to our dogs, because our dogs become a source of oxytocin and love. Breastfeeding is supposed to be a high level oxytocin release between the mother and child, so that's why it's such like a bonding moment for them. Hugging and kissing releases oxytocin, so that's why hugging and kissing is so awesome and feels good and all that stuff. And any kind of physical contact that's pleasurable can release oxytocin. So here's the idea with the biological framework. Before you give a speech, get a hug from somebody or shake somebody's hand. Have some kind of oxytocin release before you get up and you speak. That'll help combat stress, because the opposite of stress is oxytocin, in other words. So hugging and petting your dog, that's why it lowers your blood pressure and it's a stress relief, or being with your loved one, because that releases oxytocin and that counters the stress chemicals. Cortisol is what it is, and that's why it feels so good. So find whatever that is. And even like a picture of your loved one or a picture of your dog or whatever, whoever causes you to release oxytocin, even looking at that before you speak can help chemically. The other thing that you can do, it's called systematic desensitization. Okay. Systematic desensitization. And basically it's exposing yourself to the thing that you're fearful of, and over time, through constant exposure, you become desensitized. So this is kind of a deeper explanation for practice. If we just keep putting you in front of people and just keep putting you in situations that are public speaking like, just over time your brain gets desensitized to it, because it's just like, this is like an everyday thing. And when that happens, you just stop caring. So what helped me a lot and helped me do well in high school and college speech, I was an altar server growing up. So ever since third grade, I got used to being in front of people because every Saturday at church, I was one of the few people that went with my parents that was old enough or young enough to be an altar server. So I often had to serve by myself. So almost every Saturday, I was in front of people. Now, I didn't have to talk, so that was nice, but I was used to being in front of people. A lot of times I'll get students who sing at their church or whatever religious group they're part of, and so they already have a lot of performance under their belt. So public speaking is really easy for them because it's just another day at the chapel, if you will. So we just got to keep exposing you. The other thing you can do is called sequential muscle relaxation. Okay, so sequential muscle relaxation. And it's a little exercise you can do. You tense groups of muscles in your body for a few seconds, and then you slowly release them. So you start with your feet. You tense that up a little bit, like just tense it up as much as you can, and then slowly release. It's like meditating with your body. And I have my face-to-face students do meditation for at least 2 or 3 minutes before every class, just so they can get in their zone. And that's for their mind, but for your body, do the same thing. Tense those muscles, then release slowly. It's like breathing in slowly and breathing out slowly. And that can work wonders for you. Next, we have the cognitive framework. And this focuses on inner thoughts or cognitions. And so cognitions is basically your thoughts, like your thinking. Like when something's cognitive, it has to do with what we think, so actual thought statements. And so it's very broad when you do a cognitive framework because there's so many different schools of thought in terms of how we think. So if that makes sense, there's a lot of schools of thought about thought. So it's the same thing with cognitive theory. But there's 4 little sub-problems or 4 different ways of framing it in the cognitive framework that I'm going to talk about each. First, you have those who think of it as a framing problem. In the framing problem, the problem is that we frame the speech as a performance. So the problem for those under this approach is that you frame the speech as a performance, and that naturally creates pressure on yourself. And so because you think public speaking is a performance where you have one shot and it has to be one way, and if it goes any other way, it's wrong, it's bad, you get booed off the stage, and then, you get made fun of and you have to live in isolation and leave the country and all that stuff. So that's a framing problem because you made the stakes way higher than what they really are. So the solution for a framing problem is what we call psychological reappraisal or reframing. So the solution for the framing problem is to reframe. So this is where, for example, giving a speech is not performing. And in my very first lecture on public speaking situations, I made a point to point out that public speaking is not performing. Although most people think of it as such, and it may even be taught as such, public speaking is more or less a conversation where you're doing maybe a lot or most of the talking, but if you take it as a conversation, you open your world and you put a lot less pressure on yourself. So if you make it more conversational rather than a presentation, if you speak from an outline rather than a script, okay, which I don't allow scripts in public speaking, if you learn to make it more conversational, it'll feel more conversational. But if you script out everything, that's when you get nervous. Because when you have a script can make you more nervous because if you forget the script, you're screwed. Versus if you have an outline, you can impromptu as you go, and you don't have to worry about forgetting something because it's just an outline. So that's one way of framing it. Another approach would be to look at it as a self-talk problem. Under this, what you're doing is you're creating a self-fulfilling prophecy and you're living up to it. So this is where people will say, I don't like public speaking because my speech is always terrible. And then they get up there and their speech is terrible, right? So it's kind of like, my speech is going to suck. And then you get up there, I'm going to give my sucky speech now. Sucks. It sucks. And then you sit down, okay? So what you've done is you've created a self-fulfilling prophecy and then you've lived up to it. So The solutions to self-fulfilling prophecies that are negative, okay, is positive affirmations. What you have to do is you have to think about the positive of what you're doing. So think of it this way. I'm going to share my experience with the audience. I'm going to get up there and I'm going to tell them about whatever it is that I'm going to talk about. And it's going to be awesome because, this thing that I'm going to be speaking about, I care about. It's important to me and I want it to be important to the audience. You have to learn to reframe and you have to find a way to find value and to communicate that value of what you're talking about to your audience. You see, when you believe in it, you have to believe in it first before the audience can believe in it. Everything starts with you in public speak. I'm going to say this a lot. Everything starts with you first. So if you're not believing it, they're not going to believe it. And so if you're just like, my speech is terrible, then they're going to think your speech is terrible too. But if you're like, my speech is actually pretty good, and I think like if I do this, this, and this, it's going to go well, great. Audience is more likely going to buy it. Now, one thing you can do is you can create positive affirmations that you can say to yourself before you get up to speak. So create like a little one-word mantra or a little meme or a little saying that you can say, okay? So one of the solutions then is mantras, okay? So maybe you'll come up with one like seize the day, like a little quick thing you can say to yourself. Maybe there's like, if you're religious, maybe like a Bible verse or a Buddha verse or a Torah verse or a Quran verse or whatever. Something that inspires you, that's positive. Or maybe a lyric from a song could be something that inspires you. And you just say it before you get up there. I'm going to blah, blah, blah. I don't know. I can't think of a song right now to quote, but there you go. Also, another thing you can do, rewards. What you should do before you speak, if this is the problem of self-fulfilling prophecy, create a reward for yourself after you give your speech and think about that reward. So maybe in your first performance, what you'll do is you'll say, okay, I'm going to give this speech, but then afterwards, I'm going to take myself shopping. So then what you should be focusing on is shopping, you see? And then you can be like, look, okay, I'm going to give this speech and I'm going to go shopping if it goes well. And I'm just going to think about shopping. So awesome. Put all your thoughts on the reward of doing the speech rather than on the labor of doing the speech. You see? Most people, they get stuck in the actual delivery of the speech. I'm not going to survive, delivering this speech. But if you focus at the end of the process, I get to go shopping after I kick butt on this speech. That excites you, you see, and that can get you going versus the dread of giving the speech. Okay, then you have the attribution problem. This is where you just come up with excuses and justifications for why you're going to fail, and then they happen. So, the person before me is better, I'm not good at writing, and so you just find some kind of character flaw in yourself. It's kind of like the trait-based anxiety where you're just like, I'm not a good writer, I don't like talking in front of people, that kind of stuff. And so you let these negative thoughts overtake you. And it's kind of like a little voice in your head before you get up. You can't do it. You can't do it, Mike. You suck. You can't talk loud enough. Like there's like a little evil voice like inside of you that's like putting you down, okay? So the solution there. First off, mindfulness training, okay? And mindfulness training is, for the most part, meditation. And there's a lot of good TED Talks and YouTubes on how to meditate and why meditation is good for you. It helps you grow new brain cells. It makes you more aware of your emotions and your thoughts, so you're more in control of what's going on. And I meditate on a daily basis, so I can definitely speak to it. And it's just amazing what meditation has done for my life. And so look it up on YouTube, like meditation, health benefits. Go on Google Scholar. There's all kinds of studies on meditation. It's awesome. Or better yet, and this is another principle, name it. If there's some negative thought that keeps coming back to you, like when you're speaking, name it. So if it's like a negative thought like, I just am a bad writer. Oh, it's the bad writer excuse. The idea is this: if you can name it, you can control it. If you can name it, you can control it. So whatever it is that you name, now you're in control of it because you've named it and you're aware of it. So go through these negative thoughts that you have and give them names, and then start controlling them. Tell them to be quiet. Tell them to go where the sun don't shine, wherever. And do that. All right. Lastly, we have the evolutionary framework. And this approach looks at how humans have evolved over the past thousands of years and what sorts of behaviors and cognitive mechanisms can be explained by our socio-historical past. Okay? And, evolutionary theory is just about how we've progressed over time and just how we've adapted to changes in nature. Okay, so the problem. You're anxious because you're worried about the consequences of what you're doing. So a fundamental element in the growth of our societies is that people need to have status, right? And status is important because that's how you survived as far as getting food, shelter, sexual partners, etc., right? Because if you had status in the society, you were able to get these things easier than if you were like the outcast of society. If you're the outcast of society, people don't want to do anything for you, and then you're on your own to do stuff, and that's hard. It's hard to survive when you're on your own. You need other people to help you. You need other people for companionship, for sexual partners, all of that stuff. So some evolutionary psychologists then have argued that social anxiety is an adaptive feature for humans. And the idea is that your social status will lead you're basically constantly aware of your social status, and anxiety is what prevents you from doing things that you think will hurt your status. So your anxiety is kind of like the last minute, like, okay, don't do this because you could really hurt your status and that could hurt your survival. And so that's why public speaking for some people, it's about status. It's a loss of status. It's about a loss of face. It's about a loss of ego, that kind of thing. And that's what anxiety is for. That's what the anxiety is doing. So the solution. So the problem is status, okay? Status protection, if you will. Protect status. The solution is don't be so future-oriented. So this is where staying in the moment is critical, because the reason you're worried about your status is because you're thinking about the consequences already, but you haven't even given the speech yet. The key is to stay in the present moment and just focus on giving the speech and worry about the consequences later. And this is where, once again, meditation is very good, because meditation teaches you to stay in the moment. In fact, that's the whole practice of meditation, is staying in the moment. So have a present-oriented mindset of flow experience. Another thing you can do is a physical activity before you talk. So this is where getting in the zone starts to come into play. So if you're somebody who can get into the zone somehow, there's different ways of doing this. So doing push-ups, for example, that often gets people into the zone. It gets their mind focused because you're focused on the physical activity, and so that gets you there. Maybe a mind-capturing activity, like Sudoku or a crossword puzzle, something that forces you to focus on just one thing and not anything else. Listening to music can also get you in the zone. So that's why some people, like when you look at athletes and stuff, they are listening to music as they walk into the locker room. That helps them get into the zone. The idea is that you got to find a way to get into your zone to where all you're focusing on is that one thing. And when you do that, you then kind of shut down all that chatter about status, negative thoughts, and all of that, because you're so focused on the one thing that you're doing. There's just no time for that. You see? So the other solution is get in the zone. And how people get in the zone just differs from person to person. So what you need to figure out then is, how do you get into the zone? That's what you need to figure out. So the key to public speaking excellence is knowing yourself, knowing who you are, knowing how you work, and adapting your performances to optimize how you best work. So, otherwise, that's pretty much it on state management. I know this was a lot of information and a lot of lecture, but this is life enhancing skills right here that you're learning, and you can use this for pretty much anything.